And he seemed so smug and happy with himself. And I know that that is because
a couple of TikTok videos went viral in which a woman is talking about the fact that she fell in love with her psychiatrist, which happens once in a while. But she's also talking about the fact that she's being treated unfairly, unprofessionally, and even potentially is talking about abuse. My name is Marco Sander. I am a licensed psychotherapist here in Germany, and I'm just going to react to what she has to say.
I fell in love with my psychiatrist, and he knew, and he kept me until I had the strength to leave after 4 years. Here it is, part 1. So I decided to go back on ADHD meds after many years of being off of them. I was on them in my early 20s to help me get through college, and then I went off of them because they just weren't, like, the side effects were too much over the benefits. But then in my late 20s, I read this book, Taking Charge of Adult ADHD, and it absolutely changed my life. For my fellow ADHDers, there's so many good things in here. And the biggest thing that I took away was that it's very important for ADHDers to be on meds. So I decided to make an appointment with a psychiatrist. I just Googled.
A lot of people confuse psychiatrists with psychotherapists. I'm a psychotherapist. I studied psychology and also did a psychotherapy training. I'm not allowed to prescribe any meds. A psychiatrist studied medicine and also potentially did an additional training in psychotherapy, but they're allowed to prescribe meds. I'm not.
That I lived in, and I went with the first one that came up, and I got an appointment within a month. And then I booked a 90-minute intake, and I show up to the intake, and this man is my age, and I can't help but notice that he's pretty attractive, this psychiatrist.
It's not unusual, by the way, that clients fall in love with their psychotherapist or psychiatrist. It's not like it's happening every day, but when you come to therapy, usually the professional you're talking to is listening closely. You know, they understand your perspective, they're really there. And sometimes that's the very first time in their clients' lives that this even happens. A lot of needs that have never been met in life, and maybe that's even the first time somebody closely listens. And having this over weeks and weeks, disclosing a lot of information, you know, progressing, looking into the pain and suffering, a strong bonding can happen. And then often, not often, that's not true, but then sometimes it can happen that you feel very close to your psychotherapist or psychiatrist, and that can be also addressed in the psychotherapy session if that happens. So there's nothing unusual that happens once in a while.
So in this intake, you know, I kind of clocked that he was attractive in my age, but when I tell you that I've had a lot of couch time in my life, a lot of therapy, you know, I just went right into it. I trusted him enough, of course, why wouldn't I, to tell him about my childhood trauma, my daddy issues, if you will.
Also interesting, she mentioned daddy issues here. We got no further background, but it's also interesting that the psychiatrist is male as well. What then sometimes happens is that a so-called transference is occurring. So basically the feelings, emotions you had with your father can then over the process of the therapy also be transferred on to the therapist. You know, maybe the love that you never received from your father, or maybe you got so few, you were always looking for love, always trying to do it right. And then finally you're talking to another man, which you subconsciously confuse with your father. And this man is giving you this love, you know, he's listening, he's understanding you. Then it can happen that you're actually falling in love here, but it's just due to some sort of transference happening. So it's just about the father and the unmet needs from back in the days. And that's why, and I love this as a psychotherapist, that's why you need to understand the dynamic that evokes with the psychotherapist or psychiatrist. And also it's your task as a professional to bring that up, to understand what's behind, what are we actually talking about. You know, I hope the psychiatrist noticed at some point that my client is falling in love. Let's deal with that. Let's maybe even make this as explicit. What kind of feelings evolve? Is she getting hurt again, like back in the days? What does this remind her of? So basically, by talking about the dynamic and also even her falling in love, you can get right to the core and actually continue doing psychotherapy. And that might happen here as well. An attractive man and her father and daddy issues she talked about. We don't have any details, but there might be some transference happening. And the falling in love might be not about the therapist or the psychiatrist, but actually about her own feelings and that wound that she had from back in the days. Just a hypothesis.
What I had went through, all of the relationship trauma that I had. I was 6 months sober at this time, but like all of the drinking and substance use I used to do, and he just listened and nodded. And that's the thing about psychiatrists, is that they're good at pretending to listen.
Interesting what she says here. They're good at pretending to listen. I'm just curious, again, we don't know. Maybe the psychiatrist was really just pretending. Maybe he was not a good psychiatrist at all. Could be, maybe he was weird or whatever. But I would be curious, why does she feel like somebody's just pretending to listen to her? Is it maybe too good to be believable? Or does it remind her of her father, who always pretended? He never really listened, and she noticed he's never remembering anything. She's not really responding, really. And now there's some man listening. I can't believe that. They're just pretending. But nevertheless, I'm falling in love. And now apparently she fell out of love and is shooting TikTok videos and is being really mad about the psychiatrist. So again, this relationship pattern of like falling in love quickly and then dropping a relationship, which I guess happened here as well at some point. I guess she just broke up that psychiatry relationship. It would be lovely to explore that pattern. Is that the first time that this happened? Is she doing the same with her loved ones and the relationships she had in the past? And basically, again, use that pattern and the dynamic in the therapy session to help the client resolve the issues they're having, maybe the attachment style they're struggling with. So that's important information. And as a psychologist and psychotherapist and psychiatrist, you want to use that, reflect it with the client together, and then you're right at the core. It's going to be a very productive session if you make use of that. So don't neglect the dynamic as a psychotherapist and psychiatrist. And that's valuable stuff.
They can appear connected, but that doesn't mean that they're always connected. So I just felt really seen. And I also told him, I was like, look, I don't want to be on stimulant meds. So he listened to me and he put me on the non-stimulant ADHD med at the lowest dose just to figure out if it was going to work for me.
Part 3. So I hadn't ever seen a psychiatrist before. When I was on meds in my early 20s, I only got meds from my primary care physician. So I didn't understand how psychiatry works. So because he was figuring out my med dose, I saw him every month, and he just made me feel like I was his friend. He was really, really funny and cracked jokes and told me he was impressed with my running that I would do. And yeah. So, of course, I loved the attention that I got from him.
Again, maybe she's right. Maybe that was totally weird and maybe the psychiatrist crossed boundaries. But the way she's talking about it, there's no clear situation where he crossed the boundaries. It's totally normal that in the beginning, you call out things that you find impressive or things that the client is doing well already. That there's a good atmosphere and that you basically build a decent relationship. So of course, you not just focus always on the bad and the negative, you also focus on what is going well. You also give the client a compliment that is well meant, that you actually mean, but it's important for the psychotherapy process. Yeah, so nothing clearly wrong here, but again, yeah, maybe it was weird, we didn't witness the actual therapy session.
And it was in my 3rd session with him, because at this point we were all on Zoom, that I asked him, I said, hey, do you mind if I call you by your first name? And he's Pakistani, so I said his first name wrong. And he said, well, it's pronounced this, but yes, of course you can. And he seemed so smug and happy with himself. And I know that that is because that was his first sign that him pretending like we're friends was working. And to be fair to me, I had only ever been to therapy before. I didn't realize that, you know, it's important to call your doctor last name. I mean, I did know that. I did it with all my other doctors, but it just showed that the boundaries were blurring.
So first of all, nowadays, it's not unusual that you call your psychiatrist or psychotherapist with your first name. That depends on the professional, it also depends on the client. That's okay. That's not an objective boundary that has been crossed. And also, again, I'm curious, you know, why did she ask him to call him at his first name? You know, potentially that might be also even, you know, some testing, trying to get closer to the psychiatrist, building a very close relationship, and then again later on dropping it, you know, being disappointed. She's putting so much effort, she's loving this psychiatrist so much, she's trying to build this deep connection, but later on then, you know, just pulling the trigger and just going the other way around. Again, what's the dynamic that she's repeating here?
And he liked that.
And what she's doing here is mind reading. She talks in a way that she knows exactly what the psychiatrist thinks and why he did that, but there's actually no clear evidence. She's just mind reading, being very confident that this is the way it is. She doesn't know. She's just using that room of interpretation in her favor.
So from then on, from my third session on, I started calling him his first name. And then he just started turning up the volume on us being friendly. And he would ask me, for the first 6 sessions, he asked me, after the meds, he said, how's your bowels, bladder, and appetite? And I would say they're all normal. And then he would ask me any thoughts of harm. And apparently that's pretty common for psychiatry to ask those questions. And then on our 6th session, when things were really, you know, the chemistry was starting to be there before, like, I didn't realize it. I was like, oh, this man is just friendly. And he said, I have to ask this because it's a special interest of mine, but is there any thoughts of harm? Like, I was special to him. And I said, no thoughts of harm. And he didn't ever ask me a clinical question again. He stopped asking me about my bladder, bowels, and appetite, and he stopped asking me about thoughts of harm. So to me, I would just show up and he was like a therapy appointment every month.
So again, maybe the psychiatrist was very weird about that, but still the way she describes it is absolutely normal. As a psychiatrist, you know, they changed meds. In the beginning, of course, he's asking a couple of times about self-harm, a couple of physical symptoms. And at some point, you know, if it's perfectly fine and she's getting adjusted to the meds, it's okay to let go of those psychiatry-focused sessions and more turn them into therapy sessions and continue the work. There's generally nothing wrong with that, objectively speaking.
So I was seeing him every month and just gaining more and more respect for him because he would just tell me these little things about his successes and all of the cool things that he was doing in his life. And it made me fall for him, honestly. And he was really good at listening. And I mean, he's a Pisces, right? So of course he's going to be there and be able to go deep with my feelings, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't extracting from them. Anyway, so I would beg him to let me see him every week. Beg him, because my therapist at the time, he was fine. You know, he wasn't a predator, but he was fine. He just wasn't.
And again, so interesting, the dynamic that evolved. She's talking about the fact that she's begging for another session. I'm not sure how she did that, whether that was actually obvious to the psychiatrist. If I would have been that psychotherapist, I would pick that up. You know, what's going on here? There's this weird dynamic going on where you're becoming very needy and you're trying to get another session with me. I'm not going to be able to change your life. Like, it seems like you're fully giving me that responsibility, and it also feels like difficult for me that you're putting all that trust in me, and it seems like I need to do something here and say the magic words that you can heal. What does this remind you of? Like, how does that come across? You know, you use that information in the therapy session, and this dynamic that is going on is usually exactly the core of the psychotherapy process. This attachment style that is being built, where is this coming from? There's this wound probably, and that makes her go in this very pulley behavior. She's pulling a lot. Apparently right now she's more pushing. She's publishing TikTok videos, talking about that very publicly, being so disappointed. So this push-pull behavior that is happening of like, I beg him for another session, whereas this guy is just manipulating me. Where is this coming from? There's probably a reason for that. Behind that is a wound, potentially even some sort of trauma. And we got to work on this. And those sessions and the way she's reacting are great information to get to the core. So I would definitely make use of that in therapy sessions.
Doing very much for me. And so that therapist retired and I got a new therapist. And this new therapist, who is a 75-year-old woman with a PhD, she was pretty helpful. So I stopped asking my psychiatrist, begging, honestly, to be my therapist and let me see him more, right? Which also should have been a red flag. But then I started focusing on this therapist. However, I would tell the therapist how obsessed I was with my psychiatrist, and she didn't do anything about it. She just was interested. She also loved stories about my dating life, and yeah, she also was getting supply from me in her own way, but that's for another part.
Interesting what she's mentioning here. She's getting supply from me in her own way. Again, this is just an hypothesis. Your idea as a psychotherapist is to always generate hypotheses and work with it. But where's this idea coming from that people make use of you? You feel like everybody is making use of you, that psychiatrist is making use of you, that psychotherapist is making use of you. Does this remind you of something? Did you maybe get that feeling in your past with your parents as well, that people are using you and not really loving you, and now you're projecting that and you feel like you're engaging in new relationships, they're going well at first, but then you don't really trust that, they're not really listening to me, they don't actually mean it, they're making use of me. Again, where's this coming from? We're right at the core. And again, just hypothesis, this is just ideas here, but I would definitely reflect them in the session and reflect them with my clients together. And again, we are right at the core of what needs to be worked on potentially.
So yes, so I got a new therapist who actually helped me. She taught me CBT, EFT, all of these different modalities. And so I went back to just being okay with seeing Irfan once a month while he was giving me these little breadcrumbs of making me feel special, telling me about his professional achievements, telling me about how he's getting international recognition. And it worked. I was really impressed. See me weekly.
And by the way, I still want to mention, maybe she's right. Maybe he was weird. Maybe he totally crossed the boundaries. The way he mentioned that, the way he's showing off, the way he's making those comments. But objectively speaking, there's nothing that she mentioned so far that clearly crosses boundaries.
See me weekly, and that is when the intermittent reinforcement started. Some sessions he'd be warm and kind and wonderful and let me in on little parts of his life and like be vulnerable with me or pretend. Other sessions he would be cold and clinical and detached. And you know what that did? It made me work harder in our next sessions. It did. And it started the addiction that I had to him.
Interesting. Intermittent reinforcement. It's interesting that she's basically talking about that push-pull behavior. I actually didn't watch that clip beforehand, but I just talked about that push-pull behavior as well. I'm curious why she is now seeing that push-pull behavior in that psychiatrist. Maybe that was more of a mirror and she's actually doing it herself. But again, maybe also not. Maybe the psychiatrist is weird. Maybe he's actually doing that push-pull behavior. Maybe he's enjoying that manipulation. But again, maybe it's also just her perspective and her projecting on things. All right, I'm making a cut here because I think she shot videos for like more than an hour. If you want me to reflect and react to more of those clips, let me know. And otherwise, yeah, curious what you think. Leave a comment below and I'll see you in the next video.